Hello and welcome to the third episode of Criminal Justice Inspection Unpacked, the podcast of Criminal Justice Inspection Northern Ireland. I'm Melanie McVeigh and today I am joined by two guests to discuss the latest CJI inspection, looking at the approach of the criminal justice organisations in Northern Ireland to supporting vulnerable older people in our community. They are Eddie Lynch, the Commissioner for Older People in Northern Ireland, and CJI's lead inspector, Rachel Lindsay. Eddie is an independent champion for older people whose role is to safeguard and promote their interests. He has held the position of Commissioner since June 2016. Rachel is an inspector with CJI with over 16 years' experience, who has led on a range of inspections and reviews, including those focusing on other areas of vulnerability, including sexual and domestic violence and abuse. Eddie, Rachel, it's great to have you, but can I say both of you look to be pretty young and pretty healthy. So you wouldn't fit my perception of someone who's either older, vulnerable, or both. Is it a case of we're all aging and you're ahead of the curve and looking to the future? Rachel?
Well, I think ultimately we'll all be an older person at some point, and we all have older people within our families and friends and communities.
And what about you, Eddie? Is it the creep of age that's coming to you at the moment?
Well, I think one of the benefits of my job is that I have a vested interest in all the work that I do because, making things better for older people is good for everybody. And that's, across all the range of work. If we can make things better for older people, we are making things better for everybody potentially in the future. And that's the plan.
We're all on the same journey, in other words.
Hopefully.
Rachel, perhaps I can turn to you. Can you tell us what prompted the inspection and what it's been about?
Well, in CGI, since our beginning, we have looked at the impact of crime and the response of the criminal justice organisations to victims and witnesses in general through our work looking at victims and witnesses of all types of crime, but also individuals who are subject to particular types of crime or who potentially are vulnerable because of their own circumstances. So you mentioned around the work we've done around domestic abuse and sexual abuse, and those two crime types can affect anybody, but would have a particular impact on people, and people can be particularly vulnerable as a result of those crimes. But we've also looked, for example, at hate crime, where people from minority communities or minority groups may be subject to crimes that the general population would not be. So this inspection was an opportunity to look at older people who are vulnerable because of their particular circumstances that are more likely to affect those who are later in life in terms of perhaps their living circumstances, the potentially health issues that they experience, or cognitive issues such as Alzheimer's and other types of dementia. So it was an opportunity for us to specifically look at the issues that affected older people as victims of crime and the response of the organisations to that.
One of the things I was surprised to discover when I was reading through the inspection was that there seems to be a variance about when somebody's deemed to be an older person. Some organisations go for the benchmark of 50, some go for 60, 65, and there may even be a bit of variance in there as well. Where did you decide to draw the line for the purposes of this inspection?
There is, as you say, variances, and there is no kind of statutory definition either here or internationally around what constitutes an older person. So we were really guided by some of the international bodies such as the United Nations, the World Health Organisations, and then within the UK around sort of the Health Service and in policing around where the line is drawn. So we used both sort of 60 to 65 as a group and above. That's not to say, therefore, that everybody who is over 60 is automatically vulnerable, or that people who are below 60 may not be subject to some of those same vulnerabilities. But we use that as a kind of starting point, really, as that's generally accepted. That's around the age where people's life circumstances change in terms of retirement, finishing work. Perhaps that's where health will start to decline. and other other life circumstance changes.
Yeah, Eddie, just with turning to yourself and your own perspective, why do you feel vulnerable older members of the community need to have special consideration and should be the focus of pieces of work like this?
Yeah, well, firstly, I really welcome this piece of work, this report. I think it's a very important issue, and it's an issue that I have heard from, doing research in the past with older people and some of their experiences that they've had with the justice system. There clearly is a lot of barriers that older people face when they go through the justice system. Those barriers can be both mental barriers, where there's, an element of fear, trepidation from older people about, what it's going to involve, the length of time, how they give evidence. And there's a lot of those things that do raise levels of fear within them. But we've also discovered in the past, physical barriers as well. A lot of our court buildings are quite outdated and not very accessible. So that can cause problems for older people who have physical disabilities, for instance. So this is really important work. And I think, this needs to be looked at because for two reasons. One, for the older people themselves who may need that extra support. And Rachel's right. I mean, a lot of older people won't view themselves as vulnerable, but I think there needs to be something in place that, offers that extra level of support if they feel they need it. And that will be better for the person going through the system. It will lead to better evidence. So it's good for both the older person and for the justice system and the court, and probably gives a better outcome as a result of that.
Certainly it sounds as if that a lot of your work is leading to in a similar way to the material that CJI has been putting forward as well. Rachel, can you tell us a little bit about what you actually looked at as part of this inspection? There's talk of a victim's journey. Can you maybe expand on that?
So in most of our pieces of work where we look at the experience of victims and witnesses, we would look at the journey through the criminal justice system. So from even before somebody is a victim of crime, around what crime prevention advice is given to people, which is particularly important for older people, around the views of the fear of crime. And then when somebody is a victim of crime, that first response generally from the police in response to the report of crime, the investigation process that then is undertaken, when the case then passes to the prosecution service, how they make decisions about whether they will prosecute or decide not to prosecute. And then when the case comes to court, how the victims are treated during the court process, the access arrangements that are made for them, their experience of the hearings, and the information that's provided through that journey. In this inspection, we also looked at information provided from the probation board in terms of the victim information schemes, where someone can register for information about the conditions or the arrangements for people after they've been convicted of a crime in terms of their prison sentence, if they're released, when they're released from prison, around information about what conditions are placed on them during their release, and so on. So we really looked at that kind of start to finish process and to try and get an understanding of how the victims felt they were treated by the system.
And it sounds as if you were speaking to all parts of the system, from the police through to the prosecution, the courts, the probation, and that whole process from start to finish. As part of that work, I noticed that there was a lot of engagement with stakeholders and other organisations that are actually representing the views of those who are older or vulnerable in our community. Why was that important, and particularly why is it important to be engaging with organisations like Eddie's?
Well, in CGI, obviously, we are removed from direct contact with victims, which other organisations like Eddie's or like victim support organisations would be involved in. So we always feel it's really important to hear the voice of the victim, and the best way for us to do that is through those support and advocacy services. So in this inspection, we spoke to victim support, who would obviously offer services to all victims of crime and also run the witness service at court. So we spoke to them to get their perspective about older people, but also some of those organisations that specifically work with older people, the likes of Age NI, the Alzheimer's Society, Dementia NI, to get a sense around what the issues were that the people they represent were bringing back to them. We were also fortunate to speak to a group of victims directly through Women's Aid, Antrim, Ballymena, Carrickfergus, Larne and Newton Abbey. They have a specific older women's group where it's older women who've all been victims of domestic abuse, and those women were very good to give us their time and their experience of being through the system directly. And then obviously with the Commissioner's Office, we knew that the Commissioner had done work around older victims of crime, so we had really good conversations about that work and what their findings were.
Maybe, Eddie, that's a good opportunity to ask you, why did you feel it was important to get involved, and what were you hoping to get out of that process?
Well, because we were very happy to be involved in this work, because we see it as an important issue. Because in my engagement with older people over many years, I've been very aware that they have had concerns in relation to the justice system. Also, one of the big issues that I have had over the years has been the levels of fear of crime amongst older people. That was something that I have felt was very real, and I think part of that fear was actually in dealing with the process and dealing with the different bodies. So I think anything that sort of brings people together to listen to the people who have been victims, what their experience is the best way of learning and linking people up with the authorities. So I think there are definite reasons why older people particularly can be vulnerable in relation to reporting crimes, going through the justice system. Part of that could be the isolation that many older people statistically live alone more than other age groups, so they don't maybe not have that family support, be able to talk through the aftermath of being a victim of a crime, or even just getting that support and going through the process. A lot of them back off, and a lot of older people have told me over the years that they actually haven't reported crimes because they don't want to go through that process. So I think all of this is really useful in trying to create a system that is more supportive of people, that gives that level of support where people need it. And I think that can be something good for the individual, but good for our society as well.
Rachel, Eddie's comments, are those the type of issues that you've been reflecting and finding as part of this inspection work?
Yeah, absolutely. The statistics that are published by the Department of Justice show that fear of crime is higher amongst older people than in other groups, even though in general crime levels are lower, although there are some examples of types of crime that would be sort of higher, that older people would experience those types of crime compared to other types more so than younger people. So, for example, domestic abuse levels, older people would be more likely to suffer domestic abuse or a burglary than they would, for example, an assault in the street, which is different to the general population. So there are perceptions around the crime levels amongst older people and those particular types of crime that older people would be fearful of. And as Eddie says, some of those fears arise because of the circumstances in which older people live. So obviously, if you live alone, perhaps in a rural area, you are going to be more likely to be frightened that somebody will burgle your house compared to, if you're living in a group situation or a family. So fear of crime was a real concern. We found that there was a lot of work done by the police and their partner organisations, so some of those stakeholders that we mentioned, around crime prevention and about addressing those fear of crime. So, for example, the Scamwise partnership, Scamwise Northern Ireland, is a really good example about targeting messages to older people around how they can avoid being a victim of scams, what to do if they think they've been a victim of scam, addressing those fears of the stigma of feeling, if you're a victim of a scam, that people will think you're stupid or gullible or naive. So there was those types of partnerships, as well as other types, the Herbert Protocol around helping to quickly look for people who have gone missing because they have dementia or Alzheimer's. So the police really focused on that and were very heavily involved in all types of partnerships. We also found that the police had a focus on older people who were victims of crime. So in terms of people who were repeat victims, there was a focus on identifying those people more quickly when they were aged over 60 or above, and particularly over 80. For older victims who were subject to burglary, there were specific resources available to officers in terms of a toolkit about how to investigate those offences, and that kind of additional support and attention paid to those types of crimes. So the police have a strategy around older people, and they have this kind of focus on it. We didn't find that other organisations had a similar kind of strategy or policy specifically to older people. But we have pointed to the work that the Commissioner has done with the Prosecution Service around trying to get the Prosecution Service to look more closely at cases involving older people. And that's something we've encouraged them to try and build into their policies. We also, as Eddie mentioned, about the barriers that face older people, whether that be to do with their living circumstances, to do with their physical health or cognitive issues that might be maybe more likely with older people. And again, we've pointed to work that we've done in our victims and witnesses inspection, which says that all the organisations, the police and the prosecution service, need to have a greater focus on the needs of those individual people. So rather than treating everybody the same, they need to be looking at what are the factors that make these people vulnerable, and how can we help overcome those barriers to reporting in the first place, but also particularly when they're in the system, continuing to get them to support the prosecution. So, for example, I was just going to say, in terms of delay, delay is an issue that we have highlighted for many years across the system, affecting all ages of people. But for older people, what we found is that this has an even more significant impact than it does for younger people, in terms of the likelihood of the people continue to engage in the prosecution, but also particularly where someone has Alzheimer's or another form of dementia, their ability to give their best evidence in court. And then very sadly, as we saw in some of the cases that we looked at, that they may even die before the outcome of the case.
Well, there's two interesting points there that I'd like to bring Eddie in on. One is about the importance of the individual and the importance of an approach that recognises everybody's individual needs. And the other aspect is to bring you in on, Eddie, is around a delay and what's happening there.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I mean, older people, they're not a homogenous group like they're at any other part of society. They're all different, their own personalities. Some will be more confident than others. So that's just important to have that as a starting point, because some people will feel that they're well capable of representing themselves. But I think a system that is adapting to the individuals is really important. I think, to get that level, to get the best possible evidence, it's, having those conversations early on in the process with an older person to see, do they require any support? Do they have any concerns or fears about the process where they need some extra support? I think the issue around the length of trials is definitely a big factor in older people as well. Many older people have said to me in the past, they just don't want to commit themselves to go through a long process that they'll find tough going. That they'll find it hard. It'll be both physically, mentally, emotionally tiring for them. So those are all factors that are definitely in older people's heads when they do become a victim of a crime. So the system does need to respond in a way that is supportive, and make sure that the older person has the best possible chance to give their evidence and go through the process as pain-free as possible.
Were you, when you read through the inspection, Eddie, were you heartened by what Rachel was saying about positives, or were you disappointed to find that I suppose the criminal justice system wasn't more forward-thinking about how it engages with the older communities?
A bit of both, to be honest. I think there is, as Rachel has pointed out, there has been some good progress made. I think things like the Scamwise partnership has been a really excellent partnership that has grown and gone from strength to strength over the last number of years. making a lot of older people more aware and more equipped to deal with scams. My office has done a lot of work with the PSNI on financial crime as well, working well with the Economic Crime Unit. We're highlighting some financial abuse of older people, and we do feel that there's been improvements there in terms of how those cases are being taken seriously. But there's definitely scope for improvement. You know, I think there are gaps in the system. This report is pointing out the fact that still a lot of the data being collected by some organisations isn't broken down by age. That's something that I, very early on in this job, was quite surprised the amount of organisations that weren't looking at age as a key data set, and particularly in relation to crime and justice, because I think there are very specific characteristics for older people. And I think any organisation, you know, this is the biggest growing part of our population. We're living in an ageing population. That's only going to increase over the years to come. So I think any organisation worth its salt needs to adapt to that and say, well, how are we meeting these people's needs? Have they any specific needs? And do we have to do things in a different way to do our job better? So there's a lot of, I'm very positive about this report. I think the recommendations are very, very good. And, you know, but I suppose, you know, it'll come down to, you know, the acceptance of the recommendations and most importantly, the implementation of them. You know, at the end of the day, it has to, you know, hit the ground. It has to make a difference in the ground. It has to make a difference in the practice. And hopefully if that all happens, what we'll see is a better justice system that actually is a better system for an older person to go through.
Rachel, just about that, there's a number of recommendations in this report. I think it's 5 in total. There seem to be quite practically focused. Was that a deliberate approach from the organisation and from yourself, something that will make a difference on the ground?
Well, absolutely. I mean, as Eddie says, the success of any inspection is the ability of the organisations to make those changes and improve the system. So what we always strive to do is make those recommendations achievable, practical, and things that hopefully will make a difference.
Do you think the recommendations you've seen within the report around better assessments by the police around the needs of vulnerable older people, maybe more communication around some of those excellent fraud and crime prevention initiatives, and ensuring that goes further, and with other organisations like the Public Prosecution Service, just making having a greater focus on older people within their internal policies that will then lead to better practice on the ground. Do you think in the current economic climate, these recommendations are the right type, that they are ones that are still achievable when we're talking about budget pressures and resourcing pressures?
Yes, I think they actually are very practical, and I think they are very achievable as well. You know, these recommendations are, you know, they're not something that's going to cost organisations a huge amount of money. It's just about more changing their practices and looking at their system. You know, the levels of support that we want to see for older people, I think, can be achieved. It's not, I don't think, a huge financial burden on organisations. It's more of a cultural shift, I think. It's more of a recognition, maybe being a bit more aware of the ageing population and the fact that actually more of our clients, if you like, are going to be in this age category in future. That's just the way things are going across society. And, you know, I see that in a lot of areas of my work, not just in justice, but in other areas as well, where sometimes organisations are kind of slow to adapt to the ageing population. And I think that's something that can obviously affect older people, but also it affects, you know, the ability for an organisation to deliver what it's meant to do. So I think the report is very welcome. I think that the recommendations are very, very sensible. I think actually if they're implemented, they will really make an improvement on the ground and actually have the real scope to improve the system and give a better experience for older people going through it.
Maybe this is a bit of a challenging question, or maybe it's a red rag here, but is there anything else that you would have liked to be seen in there?
Well, I think if the report, I mean, in general, is covering the issues. I think it's flagging up the issues that I would have found from engaging with older people. It's certainly, to me, it ticked the boxes in terms of the big issues that I've had come across, you know, into our office. And when I go out and speak to people, I think the other issue, you know, that older people do raise, and it's been mentioned about, is the length of time of these things. Certainly is off-putting for people if they feel they're going to be embroiled And many older people, particularly those, in the older age category, are thinking, do I need the hassle? Do I need to commit something that might go on? They may be in poor health. They may be thinking, am I up to this? Do I really want to spend the next year or two in this process? And so that can be quite daunting. And even if an older person does want to sort of pursue to get justice, quite often they may be put off by the system. So I think communication, you mentioned as well, I think communication is critical. I think there's a lot of areas where the justice system can get better. And because I still think for many people, it's kind of an unknown space and what the process is. So I think communicating to people what would be expected, what the stages are, but also telling them what support is there. And I think if we do that and get better at doing that, we'll have a better system and probably have better outcomes as a result.
Just picking up on one of those points, sort of one of the things that has been included in the inspection, Rachel, addresses that whole issue of delay and the fact that a delay of maybe 12 months, 18 months, 24 months can have a significant change in somebody's personal health, their capacity, and their general ability to participate in the system. There was a suggestion that there was an opportunity for more use of video recorded evidence. Could you just very quickly give us a sense of what you were hoping to achieve with that?
Yep. So legislation provides for the ability to record video evidence in particular types of cases. So most often we would see those with child victims, but also victims of sexual abuse, where those people may find it traumatic to repeat the details of what's happened to them, and particularly when that comes to being in a courtroom. So the legislation is already there, and it's very tried and tested practice for the police to use this type of video recorded evidence, and for the prosecution service to then use that to make decisions and to present that in court. So what we're asking is for the police to consider about a greater use of those types of video recorded evidence where they have a belief that the person may not be able to give their best evidence later on. So, for example, if someone is in the early stages of dementia, or if someone, as Eddie says, is very elderly, we know that the cases take a long time to come to court. So there is the chance that by the time that happens, that person may not be able to give their best evidence or may sadly no longer be with us. So again, as Eddie says, it's not about additional resources. That ability is already there. It's about speeding up the process where it needs to be done and trying to get those cases progress faster.
Do you think, Eddie, that that's the type of approach that could actually support older vulnerable victims to engage, and they would take the daunting aspect out of it?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that issue around video messaging could be a real game changer for a lot of people, frankly. I think if many groups of vulnerable older people would be more willing to go down the route of giving the evidence if they had that to do it in that setting, I think there's a number of advantages. It allows them maybe to do that more quickly, and then it's banked, if you like, rather than waiting and worrying about going to court and giving evidence over a long period of time. But also, as Rachel says, the health reasons as well. If somebody has a debilitating health condition, has a condition that's getting worse, that becomes a real issue in them giving evidence down the line. And it would seem to make sense from a justice point of view that if you can capture good evidence earlier, and it means that you have that when you go into court, that would seem to make good sense from the justice system. So I think that would be something that would make a big difference to many older people there. And I actually think it would have a significant effect on their decision whether to proceed or not.
What about hopes for the future from both of you? What would you want to see happening from now on? And do you think this is a subject and topic that should be returned to in the future?
Yeah, so I mean, we are hopeful, obviously, as we are with all our inspections, that the recommendations will be implemented. We've aware that the police and the PPS, who the recommendations are aimed at, have accepted the recommendations and will be hopefully publishing their action plans alongside the report. So we would intend usually to follow up our inspection reports after a period of time. We would hope that they have taken steps to address the recommendations.
And I take it, Eddie, you'll be keeping a watching brief as well?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's quite exciting, the recommendations coming out of this report. I think that it's very doable. And I think that's the good thing, that it's a report that you can see that this could actually be implemented. And I think if implemented, could make a real change on the ground and help a lot of older people through the justice system. So yes, I'll be keeping a close eye on this. We'll keep in contact with CGI to make sure that, because the key of all of this is implementing the recommendations and making a real difference on the ground.
That brings to a close another informed conversation on a topic that impacts on us all, be it directly as an older person or someone who's more vulnerable, or indirectly as the family member or friend of someone who's older and more vulnerable. Or maybe we're all simply just looking to the future and thinking about what it might hold for each and every single one of us. Thank you, Eddie and Rachel, for your insights and your time today. No doubt you will be, as Eddie said, keeping a close eye on what happens next and the delivery of those improvements. In the next episode of Criminal Justice Inspection Unpacked, we'll be looking at what the Northern Ireland Prison Service has been doing to improve the operation of their care and supervision units, where some of the most challenging men and women in our prisons are held. It's going to be a conversation you won't want to miss. I look forward to joining you again soon for another behind-the-scenes look at what's happening to deliver better outcomes and a better justice system for all.